Alrighty, research methodologies, lesson 5. This is going to be a juicy one. Make sure you go to your contents page up the top, highlight and date today's lesson, and here we go. So we are moving from, we've looked at the conceptual side of society and culture now, we've done a lot of work there. We're now going to be looking at the research side, the other pillar of society and culture. So again, I'm really going to stress the importance of this. The why we're doing it is that in year 12 your PIP major work is worth 40% of your final course mark. 40%. So that's not including the HSC internal assessments. 40% raw of your total final course mark will be determined by your PIP, and that is very much based on your ability to research effectively. So that's why it's really important we learn about this. The other important thing is that in your HSC, the first section of your paper has multiple choice questions, on research methodologies and methods. So that's the other important part, is that and I'll show you an example. Here it is, just from last year's. At which step of the research process would a social researcher make recommendations and address implications of their findings? So you really got to know about it. There's another research question here. So there's 1, 2, 3, another research method, focus groups, so another research, so 4. So 4 out of the 8 multiple choice. So half your multiple choice questions had research based components in there. So really important that we know it because it's in your exam. And also in your assessment task, every one of your assessment tasks this year is going to be assessing your ability to do and know your research methodologies to some capacity, whether that's recalling information, applying it, or conducting your own research. You will need to know this back to front as well, okay? And that's really to prepare you for the PIP and major work that we have next year, okay? So super important. So I guess our learning intention today, what we're actually going to do is we're going to explore the differences between what we call quantitative and qualitative research. So we're going to break research into 2 parts, and then we're going to determine the strength and weaknesses of each of those research methods themselves, but also the differences between qualitative and quantitative, okay? So that's our focus for today. So what I've got here to start with, and for the rest of the lesson, is 2 tables. So these are what I'm going to get you to make concept cards of, but I'll explain that a little bit later. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to break down types of research, okay? And there's 2 types. There's quantitative research and qualitative research. Now they sound very similar. One starts with quant with an N, and the other is qual with an L. Qual. So I'll start with quantitative first, and I want you to draw an arrow somewhere here, and I want you to write the word quantity. Quantity. So I'll type it here for you if you're not sure on the spelling. Quantity. I'm going to delete that, so pause if you're writing it. I want you to think about quantity because quantitative research is all about numbers. It's about raw data, statistics, trends, tables, graphs, diagrams. That's what you want to think of when you think of quantitative research. So I guess the proper definition of it, there isn't like a one sentence wonder sort of definition. So it's all this. So that's where I want you to think about data, think about those sorts of numerical values. So what quantitative data does is it enables the collection of specific data. So if you want to draw an arrow up here and write e.g. numbers or numerical data, that might help. So specific data from a sample of a relevant population. The findings may then be extrapolated for the whole population under study. So extrapolated simply means that you're using those findings from a small population of group and applying them to a large one. So if anyone's seen the TV show Family Feud, what they do is they ask 100 people, or that new show with Andy from Hamish and Andy, can't remember his last name, it's called 100 people. Basically, a lot of how people do it is they interview 100 people, and that's meant to kind of represent 100% of the population. So they make sure that, say the percentage of a population in Australia, for argument's sake, was, and I'm just making this up, 52% female. They'll make sure 52 out of those 100 people are female to reflect that. With certain ethnicities and cultures, those percentages, they'll try to reflect it, age ranges, etc., all that sort of stuff. It's never going to be perfect, but to get everyone in the whole country to do a study is super unrealistic, and you can't do it. So that's why they do these smaller studies and then extrapolate the trends bigger. So that's what extrapolated means. You take the findings from one place and you apply it to others. So that's where quantitative data is really powerful. Is because it can be measured, counted, and quantified. That's the other bit I want you to note. So again, that's to do with numerical data. So you can measure it, it's tangible. You can see that if you did a quantitative study on how many female students were at Brisbane Water in 2021 versus 2022, I can measure that statistically in terms of raw numbers, in terms of percentages, and I can see whether it's increased or decreased, and then I can maybe look into some reasons why later. But I need that raw data to tell me the differences there. So the focus then on quantitative research is the what and how many. So what are we looking at and how many, or how much? Is maybe another word you want to put in there. And write that in. So some dot points here, and I want you to write this as a heading, is characteristics. So these are some characteristics of quantitative research in this table below now. So it doesn't necessarily always have to have every single one of these things. It's very much like if I scroll up to social and cultural literacy characteristics, here is that you don't necessarily have to have all of them to be able to identify it as a socially cultural literate characteristic. It's just one of many. So characteristics of quantitative research is it produces easily quantified and tabulated data. So what quantified means is it's counted. Okay, you can count it. Tabulated data means that you can organize it. Okay, so you can organize that data clearly. So instead of having hundreds of numbers just randomly on a page, if you put it in a table and in columns and you label it, it's really easy to understand. So that's what those two words mean. If you can write those above that, please. Second one, information is collected by counting and is able to be collated into percentages and then represented by tables and graphs. So I'm just getting you to highlight the sort of key words that really reflect that quantitative method. Okay, counting, collating, tables and graphs. So I'm pretty sure you all know what counting is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You do it at a bigger scale, of course, when you research. But collated, what collate means is that you take all those numbers and you organize them. Okay, or you change the form they're in. That's what collating is. You make it, I guess, easier to understand. So instead of saying like 4/8 of people agree with, I would just say 50% of people agree with. So by collating it into a percentage, it's easier to understand. Quantities and trends can be identified and comparisons can be made easily. That whole point is a really important characteristic of quantitative research. Because it's numbers, it's really easy to compare something. So you can compare the raw numbers, like I said, of female students one year to female students the next year. It's quite easy to compare. And then to compare to other studies as well. That's another thing. So if you did your study that said a certain percentage of female students attended school, then you look at someone else's study, you can compare those raw statistics very easily and very quickly. So that's, I guess, a strength of that as well. It quantifies the findings in numerical data, tables, graphs and diagrams. So again, the syllabus is kind of repeating itself here, but you get the idea. Structured data collection equipment with closed-ended or rating scale questions. So here is where you can be a bit more dynamic with your quantitative data. Instead of saying yes or no, you might say, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? 1 to 5, 1 being not at all, 5 being absolutely. And you can measure quantitative data that way. Here I want you to I know you can't just do what I've done. I want you to add strengths here as well. So the characteristics and strengths are here, but the weaknesses of it are here. So I want you to, you may want to highlight these in a different color, or if you just write on the side here, weaknesses, and then on the side here you write strengths, you might want to do it that way. So if you actually label it like that, that's probably a good idea. The weaknesses of quantitative research, though, is that it doesn't allow the researcher to interact closely or personally with those being questions. The process is impersonal and as objective as possible. So this last bit, I'll start with the first bit. So because you can't interact closely with someone, you don't really know the reason why behind the numbers. So we might say that 52% of female students, BWC students are females, but we don't really know why. And let's say it's decreased over the years, we won't know why based off just the raw data. We've got to go deeper. So that's a weakness of quantitative research, is that you get the raw data, but it doesn't go deeper than that. That's where you need qualitative research, which is where we'll come to in a second. And the other weakness is that it's objective as possible. Now, I don't want you to 100% view this one as a weakness. So above here, can you write brackets can also be a strength or can also be strength? The reason being objective is a strength is that it's more reliable data. Okay, it can be more reliable if it is objective. Okay, it's based on factual information. There's no limited room for it to be interpreted differently. So that can be a strength. But that can also be a weakness because a lot of the times, whilst you might hear the saying the numbers don't lie, the numbers can lie. And it really depends on how you interpret it and the reason why behind that number exists. That's really important too. So understanding what we would call the subjective reason behind things, the why, is really important too, and that can be a weakness of quantitative research. The last one as well is it really relies heavily on the researcher's ability to develop non-biased set of questions or items to record data with. So let's say I ask you two questions. Let's say I'm asking you a quantitative question and I say, on a scale of 1 to 5, to what extent do you agree with the current government's climate change policy? I'm just asking whether you agree with it or not. That's a pretty good objective question. I don't have bias in that question. I'm not loading it with my own opinion. It's just factual. However, if I said, to what extent do you agree with the government's horrible and terrible climate change policy that kills millions of animals every year and puts our country in more debt than it can afford to pay off? To what extent do you agree with that? That's a biased question, right? So as the researcher, I've got to make sure the questions I'm asking are not biased, and that it allows for the perspective of the participant to come in without my perspective influencing their answer in any way, shape or form. So that's a weakness of quantitative research, is that some researchers' ability to do that isn't very strong. All right, that's quantitative. The next thing is qualitative data. So this relies on researchers' interpretive skills. I don't know why I italicized that. To understand complex data. That's what qualitative research is about. So the word I want you to associate with this one, if you want to draw a little arrow above here, is the word quality. So what qualitative data is, it brings quality to the quantitative data. You'll notice that you sort of need both elements of data to work together to synthesize, hey, there's that action coming back, in order to make the other reliable. But you still can, there are some circumstances where just quantitative is appropriate and where just qualitative is appropriate. But qualitative research is really about the interpretive skills, the complex and detailed data, and it's very much about the why and how. That's a really good way of thinking about qualitative data. It's about the why and how. So what this includes is in-depth understanding. So it's not just a superficial surface number. It's not just saying 52%. It's giving the why behind it. So it's in-depth, and it's very much asking open-ended questions and using non-statistical research techniques or value-based observations. Another word I want you to write here is the word subjective. Subjective. So what subjective means is that it's open to interpretation. So subjective means that there's no right or wrong answer, that the answer is what it is because of someone's particular perspective, belief, or because of how it's interpreted. So for example, I can interpret data in lots of different ways. I can come up with theories or ideas behind why the numbers exist, or behind someone's response to a question that's another researcher might completely miss or ignore, or think of other things that I may not have thought of. So it's really about being subjective and open to interpretation. What an open-ended question is, as opposed to a closed-ended question. So a closed-ended question is quantitative, and it might be like something like, how old are you? That is a closed-ended question. You're just going to give me a number and tell me how old you are. If I asked you an open-ended question, it might be something like, do you believe that getting older is a good or a bad thing? Please explain your reasoning why. That is a open-ended question, because there's going to be a lot of in-depth detail there. It's going to be very value-based because it's subjective and it's based off the person's own opinions and beliefs, which therefore makes it complex and detailed, which therefore means I need to interpret the findings of that. So you can see in qualitative research there's typically a lot more effort required when recording this type of data. So some characteristics and strengths of qualitative research are the following. So you usually have a small sample, so it's not randomly selected. That's a characteristic, but it's also a strength, because a small sample allows you to get it done in a more time efficient way. If you were to do a large sample of qualitative research, it would take a long time, and that's almost kind of a weakness, which we'll get to later. It's usually an interactive process. So, and we're going to get to these methods in a second, but qualitative research is where you interview someone, you might observe someone doing something, you may do a questionnaire with open-ended questions and then ask some follow-up questions. So it's a very interactive process. So that's good in the way that it can get you more data. So let's say you ask someone an interview question and they react a bit strongly, you might be able to ask a follow-up question and really engage with them closely to find out more about the how and why they feel that way. So that's really important and a good strength too. The other thing, I just realised we haven't been highlighting these. So it's interactive, it's small sample. It usually is a narrative report so it's got conceptual descriptions. But I think the main thing I want you to take away from that is that it's conceptual, and it's very much about behaviour, values, attitudes, and beliefs. So that's very much about the how and why. So we're looking at the reason why behind the numbers and data. It'll usually contain direct quotes from people. So if that's an interview, you might quote something that they say. If it's a questionnaire response that's really open-ended that they've typed out, you can, you can directly quote that. And the other one is that it explores subjective experiences. So that's, I guess, what I was alluding to up there. No further explanation required. So there's some of the characteristics and strengths of qualitative research. Weaknesses, however, are the following. It relies heavily on the researcher's interpretive skills to understand the complexity of things. So it relies heavily on researchers' interpretive skills to understand the complexities of findings. And that can be a weakness, because if you're not good at that, then the qualitative data is going to be really weak. You have to really be able to unpack it to make it worthwhile. The other thing is it can be more challenging and time consuming than analysing numbers, because you're like if I was to interview one person, let's say that took half an hour, and instead, if I was to create a quick questionnaire, which is, or let's say, so for argument's sake, I interview someone about their thoughts on something, that might take me half an hour. If I look at a statistical study on something, I can get the numerical data really quickly, because there's more than just the interview. So I've got to come up with the interview questions beforehand. I have to communicate with the person and say, hey, when you're free, do you mind doing this? You sort of have to explain what you're talking about. You've got to make sure that they're comfortable. You then have to have the interview itself, and then you've got to collate the data afterwards. You've got to write down what they say, and then you've then got to interpret as well. So there's heaps and heaps of steps to a qualitative research process. So it can be really time consuming and challenging.